Our opening keynote, Arun Sundararajan, is a professor at NYU Stern School of Business and an affiliated faculty member at many of NYU's interdisciplinary research centers, including the Center for Data Science and the Center for Urban Science and Progress. He has authored a best-selling and award-winning book, The Sharing Economy, published by the MIT Press. Arun's research studies how digital technologies transform business, government, and civil society, with a strong recent focus on the blurring lines between platforms and government, the sharing economy, and the end of retail and the digital future of work. He has given hundreds of keynote talks at forums that include the World Economic Forum in Davos, the World Government Summit in South by Southwest. He has provided expert input on the digital economy as testimony to the United States Congress, the European Parliament, and the United Nations. Enjoy his talk entitled The Five Forces of AI. Welcome, Arun.
Thank you, Michael. I often wish people would introduce me as, here's a guy, we met him outside. He sounded like he had a few interesting things to say. So we decided to have him come and tell you a few things, and then your expectations would be in the right place. I'm going to start by taking a picture of all of you, if you don't mind. Okay, I sometimes do this when my audience is especially good-looking, like you guys are. It's also because I figure that one of these days I'm going to have grandkids. They're not going to listen to me. And I'm going to whip out these pictures and show them, saying, like, see, people used to gather to hear me speak. So maybe I actually have something of value to say. At least that's the plan. You've got 2 fabulous days ahead of you. So I thought I'd start you off with a broad perspective on how to think about changes induced by artificial intelligence. It's a term that many people decry, but it's something that is sort of transforming business in a wide variety of ways. And so I want to do 3 things today. I mean, first, I want to put into perspective, what is one way of thinking about the specter of automation, and to sort of get you away from thinking about it as purely being machines replacing humans. I know in the retail and consumer industries, automation is top of mind for a lot of people. The second thing I want to do is introduce a framework for thinking about answering the question, how fast will AI disrupt me? And the 5 forces of AI is a way of thinking about that. And finally, sort of armed with this knowledge about the different ways in which artificial intelligence can disrupt business, and a way to think about how fast this is going to be, I want to conclude by talking a bit about how we're going to plan for a future of work in which the specter of automation is not just a specter, but it's a reality. So, for a lot of people, if you ask them to think about automation, the impact of AI on someone's profession, their mind often goes to self-driving cars, autonomous trucks. This is Volvo's prototype autonomous truck. You may notice that there is no cabin for the person who needs to drive it, because the vision is that it's going to be level 5, and you're not going to need that person behind the wheel. So this is one vision of artificial intelligence and robotics displacing humans. Another vision that people have is of some sort of humanoid-like robot replacing exactly the things that a human being used to do. And so this is a robot waiter. While these might seem like good sort of mental models for the eventual impacts of artificial intelligence and robotics sort of over the next few decades, I think a much more realistic sort of way to think about artificial intelligence is, I'm missing one of my slides. Okay, a much more realistic way to think about artificial intelligence is in terms of what Amazon is doing these days. On Thursday and Friday, I spent a couple of days in Seattle. Half of one of those days was in an Amazon fulfillment center. where I got introduced for the second time to the Kiva robots. These are robots that move shelves around so that people can actually not have to move to the shelves. So they've inverted the idea of like, what does the flow of work look when assembling a box and sending it to you, where the shelf goes to the human rather than the human having to go to the shelf. As a consequence of this inversion, they are able to sort of have human beings work much more productively at assembling these boxes. And they are also able to sort of turn on its head some of the fundamental principles of inventory management. For example, they do not stock items like items next to each other. They stock items of the same size next to each other. And because every shelf is intelligent, potentially can be picked up by a robot and can be moved to where the human might need to do something with it. And every item has intelligence in it that can say, here's where I am. You can reimagine what the human being does and how the work is organized. And so, although we think about artificial intelligence and robotics in retail and consumer industries, but more generally, as being machines replacing humans, I think the vast majority of the impact of of artificial intelligence and digital technologies on business, and especially on the retail and consumer industries businesses, is going to come in different ways in the next 10 years. So you shouldn't be thinking about the machine replacing the human. What you should be thinking about are three other things. One is the machine complementing the human. So of course, the moving shelves of Amazon are a good example of a machine complementing a human. You'll hear later today, later this morning from, I think, Arun from Walmart, who'll be talking about maybe some of the fascinating ways in which Walmart is using virtual reality to have machines complement humans. But I think the biggest potential for artificial intelligence disrupting a business on this front, where the human being is not taken out of the picture, but the human being becomes more productive, is able to do things that they otherwise would not be able to do, are going to come in the energy and healthcare, in the education and healthcare spaces, where we have a vastly undereducated population. We've only sort of scratched the surface in terms of meeting the healthcare needs of the world. The critical shortage on both of these fronts are people who are qualified. And so I think there'll be an order of magnitude increase in both sort of the volume of healthcare services delivered around the world and the quantity and frequency with which we get education as people enabled and sort of are empowered by artificial intelligence technologies are able to do things that they otherwise weren't able to do. Now, another way in which AI might disrupt, your mix between humans and machines is in creating new roles for machines that require a human complement. And I think a great example here is in sort of the sales assistant and customer service functions of retail, where gradually over a period of time, we are shifting what used to be done by a human to some sort of voice-enabled artificial intelligence. Although the pace is slow, what will happen is over time, as more and more of these AIs are handling your sales function, like responding to sort of an e-commerce action and engaging with the customer, or answering your phones for you, a whole host of new roles will emerge for the human beings to actually sort of manage these artificial intelligences, to design their personalities, to sort of figure out how to personalize them, to understand whether the way in which the AI is speaking is aligned with the brand strategy that your company has. And so around the replacing of humans by machines will come a whole bunch of new roles for humans to complement the machines. Now that's one side of it. When you look at it through the lens of there are things to be done, will the machines do them or will the human beings do them? But an often ignored but much bigger force of disruption that is being caused by digital technology and artificial intelligence is the fundamental shift in business models that changes the mix of human and machine intelligence needed, or human and machine labor needed, to fulfill a customer's need. And you guys from the retail industry are no stranger to this. The business model fundamentally changes, and my belief is that the impacts of artificial intelligence and digital technologies on the retail and consumer industries are going to be much more profound from these new business model changes than they are from any of the machine replaces humans complementing humans or humans complementing machines. So that's the landscape you're looking at in terms of the disruption potential. New business models can be created that alter the need for human labor. Machines can replace humans, but much more likely they're going to be complementing humans, and there are going to be some new roles for humans in complementing the machines. So having looked at that, the question that you might be asking is, well, the artificial intelligence technologies exist. They are getting better and better. How fast are they going to disrupt my industry? To help answer that question, a framework that I like to use is the 5 forces of AI. The way you want to use this framework is in thinking about how fast is a change going to be caused by a particular digital technology. Okay, and without sort of setting this up in too much detail, let me just sort of go through these 5 forces. The first is a natural one, the pace of technological evolution. I won't spend too much time on this. The more rapidly AI technology evolves, the more likely it is that you're going to see a disruption. The other 4 are the ones that are really interesting. The second force is how profound are the data economies of scope. So let me sort of stop for a minute and explain what I mean by this. Whenever I say data economies of scope, my students have this look of sort of these bad memories of being in sort of microeconomics 1, those little curves that you used to draw come back up. But you might remember an economy of scale has to do with costs going down as the volume of production within your industry goes up. Right? Economies of scope have to do with costs going down or quality going up for a different product line or in an adjacent industry as your volume goes up. And so sort of applied to the context of artificial intelligence, there are 2 different scenarios in which you might see data economies of scope, and 2 different things that you should be looking at to try and understand, does the artificial intelligence impacting my business have profound data economies of scope. One has to do with translatability across domain. And so if you have someone's social media activity, this is data that can actually inform whether or not you should issue them a loan. So we have sort of increasingly sophisticated deep learning technologies now that can take in data activity of any kind, consumer activity of a particular kind, and translate it into a completely different domain. Right? So if you are thinking about sort of recommendation systems for retail products, there are huge data economies of scope there. You don't have to build capability in recommending products to people to be able to recommend products to them better. Someone who has built capabilities or gathered data about a different consumer activity of someone can come in from an adjacent industry and start to do what you are doing better than you because they have data about a different thing. And so a social media platform can start to operate in the retail space and make better AI-based recommendations because of these data economies of scope. So that's a context in which data economies of scope translate well across domains. The other dimension to be looking at is localization. Do the systems that I have built for one geography translate well to a different geography? So if there is a retail powerhouse that has sort of understood deeply the consumer behavior of consumers in mainland China, to what extent does that technology translate to France or to Germany? And so the more localized, the expertise that is coming from your deep learning system, the slower the pace of disruption is going to be. And so data economies of scope, 2 fronts to look at them on are domain specificity and geographic specificity. So if you consider the case of autonomous driving, for example, there are very weak data economies of scope here. I can't take my Facebook profile and my Facebook activity and translate it into driving the car better for me. And so that is an industry in which the translatability of data that has been acquired in one domain does not sort of improve the capabilities of the machines in a different domain, to a great degree. Okay, the third force to be looking at is the nature of network effects. I've been studying network effects for a couple of decades. It's one of the most popular and also one of the most misunderstood concepts associated with digital technology. You might see that that network effect sort of bubble has two arrows, one going out and one going in. And so the stronger the data economies of scope, the faster your disruption. With network effects, it's a little more complicated. Initially, if the AI technology that you are worried about displays strong network effects, the pace of disruption will be gradual. But after you hit a certain threshold, the pace of disruption will be very rapid. And so let's consider the autonomous driving example again, because it's sort of not domain specific and everybody can sort of wrap their heads around it. So autonomous driving has very strong network effects in the following sense. A fully autonomous vehicle performs much better when all the other vehicles are also fully autonomous and have the same predictability associated with them. The biggest challenges in autonomous driving come not from the capabilities of the technology itself, the technological challenges, but come from the unpredictability of cars driven by other humans. And so if you think about the pace of evolution or sort of the disruption caused by this technology, it's going to be extremely gradual at first. But once there is a critical mass of fully autonomous vehicles on the road, the switch will be very rapid because you'll see a sudden dramatic performance improvement in the existing autonomous vehicles as more and more vehicles become autonomous. So this is sort of a double-edged sword in some sense. It slows things down initially, but then you can't get complacent because you'll suddenly see a dramatic increase in the pace of disruption. The fourth force is social acceptance. I've seen so many projections over the last 5 years about the extent to which artificial intelligence and robotics technologies are going to automate different things. I'm part of a group of people in the retail and consumer industries who meets every few months to talk about sort of the planning for this. But often these reports and these predictions are couched from what I call a technologically deterministic point of view, meaning 48% of all tasks performed by human beings today can be automated using today's technology. 60% of what is done by the typical human being can be done by technologies that will emerge in the next 5 years. Now, the operational word there is can, as opposed to what will actually happen. And it comes from a technologically deterministic view, which is that if the technology can do it, then it will happen. The two barriers that stand in the way of the technology, the two sort of non-economic barriers, are social acceptance and labor resistance. And so the pace of social acceptance of different technologies is going to be very different. The pace of acceptance of sort of voice technologies that perform customer service has been gradual, in part because of limited consumer acceptance. A lot of people will bypass the system that can, in fact, fulfill all of their customer service needs and instead say operator, operator, representative, representative. That's me, on the phone with Citibank, sort of sitting in my Uber and sort of screaming into my phone, representative. I mean, that's, this is not being videotaped, is it? Of course it is. But the point is that there will be a different pace of social acceptance. And often, a lot of the projections that are being made today about the pace of automation by AI and robotics are based on studies of the adoption of industrial robotic systems in manufacturing settings. When the automation is in a factory, behind the scenes, the pace at which the technological capability translates into actual sort of changes in work is much more rapid because there is not the social consumer acceptance dimension. On the other hand, when you're talking about consumer-facing technologies, this is a very critical factor to take into account. And so again, going back to our familiar example of autonomous vehicles, it's going to be a lot longer than we think before a fully autonomous car is allowed on the road by itself at scale, not because the technology is not ready, but because it's going to take human beings a while to get comfortable with the idea of their kids being in a car driven by someone without a human being behind the wheel. And finally, I could have called this labor acceptance, but labor doesn't really accept sort of automating technologies. They resist them, which is why the arrow points out the other way. But the strength of labor resistance is a really important factor. And again, one of the dimensions that seems to matter here is scale. Retail is one of the largest employers in the country. In many countries, it is often sort of the entry point for people without a college education to enter the workforce, to sort of get into the workforce. Many of you, your first job was probably in retail when you were in high school. And so my estimates of the strength of labor resistance for the retail and consumer industries are high. In manufacturing, it was a little lower. It was high in the mid-70s when the unions were strong. As sort of collective bargaining and organized labor has lost power, the strength of labor resistance for manufacturing automation has gone down. But the strength of labor resistance for retail automation is still quite significant. And so this is definitely a factor that you need to take into account when trying to understand what is the pace of disruption by artificial intelligence going to be. Again, none of these are rocket science, in my opinion. It's just a framework for the 5 things that you should be thinking about when trying to analyze how fast will the pace of disruption be beyond the capabilities of the technology itself. Now, having said that, I'm going to spend my last 4 minutes talking about how we plan for this new future of work in which AI-enabled business models are going to displace our traditional business models, and in which machines are going to replace humans to a small extent, complement humans to a large extent, and create new employment opportunities for humans. One of the things that we need to anticipate is a significant revising of the individual-institution relationship. Over the second half of the 20th century, we got used to the idea of work being organized as full-time jobs in these sort of neat little buckets that we call jobs, situated primarily in medium to large corporations. And so from 1900 to 1960, we went from an economy that was largely self-employed to an economy that was essentially full-time employees. What this means is that how we think about preparing people for work, how we think about evolving through our careers, and how we think about protecting people, sort of building a social safety net, are all predicated on this idea that the work is going to be organized in one arrangement, which is the full-time employment arrangement. That is no longer the case. Every retail and consumer industry company that I have talked to in the last 2 years has been exploring a wide variety of non-employment work arrangements, either platform-enabled or business model changes. If I'm taking the product to the customer, then I have an on-demand delivery force instead of having full-time employees in the store. And so it is essential that we recognize that this individual-institution relationship that we got used to in the second half of the 20th century is undergoing sort of a fundamental change. And we've got a wide variety of work arrangements that are now sort of that individuals have. It's not just employee-employer. It's freelancer-platform. It's on-demand worker company. It's micro-entrepreneur, Amazon fulfillment services, 2 million people do that. And so that's something to wrap our heads around. And as a consequence, the funding of our social safety net has to be revisited. Right now, the funding model, especially in the United States, the UK, and Japan, is predicated on the idea that there is this entity, the full-time employer, that is going to be contributing money in some way to retirement, to health insurance, to paid vacations, to workplace insurance. And once we take that entity out of the picture, the funding model for the social safety net collapses. We also have to sort of get past the mindset that we are preparing ourselves, like, we go to college or we graduate high school and go to a vocational school, and we prepare ourselves for one occupation. This is largely like, most of you probably went to college. When you were in college, you majored in something and you thought about one particular occupation. You were going to go into business development, into sales, into finance, into accounting, into marketing, into human resources, into psychology, into software engineering. This was the occupation that you thought about. Now, a majority of the workforce over the next 30 years is going to have to shift occupations, not shift jobs like many of you have done, but actually say, well, my occupation is no longer a viable one. I have to retrain myself to sort of transition to a completely different occupation. And while, at least in the United States, we've created, sort of undoubtedly the best educational system in the world for early career education, for preparing you for your first job, we haven't done a very good job of creating a similar institutional structure for transitioning people mid-career, for giving someone not just the skills, but also the supporting infrastructure, the ability to sort of see, what is next, sort of where are my job prospects, how do I build the network, how do I sort of gain that tacit learning that actually allows me to sort of get a job and pursue a successful career, to transition with dignity. And so sort of a critical challenge for society over the next 20 years is constructing infrastructure for broad transition education. And the reason why I'm talking about that at this particular conference is that the retail and consumer industries are first. So if you don't have a transition education plan for your company, it's essential that you sort of invest in this, because you are going to be transitioning your workforce. You also have to think, we have to think about new ways of, giving people a way to seek community that they used to get from a large company. This is where we make our friends, meet our spouses, and so on, and to sort of track what our career path will be. As more and more of us are in these non-employment work arrangements, there have to be alternatives for that. And we also have to sort of design these AIs so that they behave the way that we want to. These are going to be the most important institutions of the 21st century. And we are building them without sort of forethought for their ethics and for the principles, the societal objectives that we want these large sort of complex systems to achieve. That's the topic of a whole different talk, but I wanted to conclude with that because if we don't design the world to be the one that we want to live in, someone else is going to design it for us, and we may not like the world that we end up with. So I'm out of time. I'm easy to find online. You might see a pattern across sort of all of my contact information. I love to hear from audiences that I speak to. I'm going to take one more picture of you guys because the lighting is better right now, and because I'm here. And so smile again, wave, express your sentiment about my talk in some way. All right, and thank you for your time.